Art and Mass Culture, Chapter 1, Why Visual Literacy, Part 2. Contrasting Cultural Icons. One of the goals of this book is to examine the visual language of our mass media. Because that language was historically developed in Western culture, the primary focus of this book is the visual language of Western Europe and North America. This language is not universal, any more than Spanish or English is universal, nor is it the best or highest visual language. Again, any more than Spanish or English is the best or highest language. In order to demonstrate that the visual language of the West is specific to one cultural tradition, and not necessarily shared by other cultures and other times, we will compare an important image, an icon from Western culture, with an icon produced outside the West. Michelangelo's David. The Western cultural icon we will focus on is Michelangelo's David. Perhaps the best way to enter into art historical engagement with such an icon is to examine it through the 6 questions of journalistic inquiry. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. Let's start with the who. Who asks about the artist? Michelangelo was one of the great masters of the Italian Renaissance. He is considered such an important cultural hero that one of the 4 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, cartoon characters created for an early childhood viewing audience, was named Michelangelo. The other 3 were Leonardo, Raphael, and Donatello. What is the subject of this artwork? What asks about the subject of the artwork? David was a great biblical hero. As a youth, he slayed the giant Goliath. Later, he became king of the Jews. He wrote poetry. Several songs or hymns from the Book of Psalms are attributed to him, and codified a legal system that is still influential today. Christians consider David the greatest king of Israel, an early ancestor of Jesus. The story of David and Goliath has resonance in the mass media. David was a young shepherd boy who protected his flocks from predators with a slingshot. He became so skilled in this rather low-tech weapon, a slingshot, that he was able to strike and kill Goliath, the leader of the army threatening David's people, by aiming his slingshot at Goliath's only point of vulnerability, the center of his forehead. George Lucas reworked the David and Goliath story in the first released Star Wars film in 1977. Where was this artwork created? Where refers to the locale of creation and or exhibition. Michelangelo sculpted David in Florence, the northern Italian city often considered the birthplace of the Renaissance. Although David was originally intended for outdoor viewing on a cathedral facade, it is now housed in the Art Academy of Florence, where it is protected from pollution and possible vandals. An important banking and trade city, as well as a major textile producer, Florence was rising in wealth and political importance at the beginning of the 16th century. The original placement of the sculpture on outside a public building would have alerted anyone who came into town that they were entering a realm dominated by powerful men of taste and distinction. When was this artwork created? When refers to the time the artwork was created. Michelangelo worked on David from 1501 through 1504. That was the height of the historical period known as the Renaissance. Renaissance is a French term meaning rebirth, and it refers to the rebirth of the classical past, of the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome that were embraced at that time. The Renaissance was a period of exploration, conquest, and imperial extension. It was also the time of the greatest Holocaust in world history, the European destruction of Native American populations through disease and warfare. When was this artwork created? One reason David is a key Renaissance monument is that it embodies Michelangelo's reappraisal of ancient Greek and Roman artistic ideals. Specifically, he used an ancient statue of a Greek god, the Apollo Belvedere, as an inspiration for the figure's pose and physique. Michelangelo portrayed David nude with classic Greek proportions and a Greek hairstyle. Just as Hollywood movie makers remake earlier films, Michelangelo created David as an updated and transformed Greek god, merging Christian and pagan symbols in a key Renaissance strategy. And just as Hollywood filmmakers idealize the characters in their historical dramas, such as using Julia Roberts to portray Erin Brockovich, so Michelangelo idealized David according to current standards of the beautiful body in Greek mode. It is probable that the real David did not have an ideal athletic body in a Greek mode. It is certain he did not guard his sheep or confront Goliath in the nude. How was the artwork created? Howe asked about the process of creating the artwork. Michelangelo used what we called subtractive sculpture for David. He began with a 14-foot tall block of white marble and carved away whatever part of the stone he did not want to remain. Michelangelo wrote that he saw the figures inside the marble and carved away what surrounded them there. He used hammers and chisels as his primary tools. Sculpting marble was an arduous labor requiring physical strength as well as finesse. Contemporary portraits of Michelangelo show him to have been a large, muscular man. Why was this artwork created? Why is often the most complex and contended question in reference to artworks. We know that Michelangelo was commissioned to create David. He worked much more like what we call a commercial artist today. People came to him, hired him to create a work that would meet their needs and desires, and paid him according to a contract. Powerful civic leaders of Florence hired him to create David. Because Florence was, at the time, vying with the giant city of Rome for dominance of the Italian peninsula, some art historians read David as a symbol of the smaller, upstart city in which it still stands. If that is true, then Michelangelo's sculpture represented the city of Florence much as the Statue of Liberty represents the United States. David's iconic power is not limited to the status of a 16th century urban symbol. David can also be interpreted as the key monument of Western culture, since it was created in the Renaissance at a time when many Western cultural values were developed and artistically reified. Why was this artwork created? Michelangelo's goal was to reproduce the external appearance of an idealized human form. We read David as a real man, even as we recognize the idealized nature of his portrayal. Such idealized realism in art that focuses on the perfected human individual continues in the mass media today, in images from film to television to advertising. We read the images in a Calvin Klein ad as real people, even as we understand that they are computer manipulated to achieve an unattainable level of perfection. Coatlicue. Coatlicue is an icon of Aztec culture. Who? Although we do know the names of some pre-Columbian artists, like the Mayan ceramic painters who signed their vessels with hieroglyphic inscriptions of their names and honorific titles, we don't know the name of the artist who created Coatlicue. So we will have to settle for attributing her to anonymous Aztec artists. What? The Aztec language was filled with significant puns. The word "que," which is often translated as skirt, can also mean hill or pyramid, in effect, a man-made hill. She of the serpent's skirts, then, could be read as she of the hills covered with serpents. This gets us close to her role in Aztec religion. Coatlicue was the earth goddess. Although the serpent has an evil connotation in Western culture, remember in the Garden of Eden, Eve and Adam were tempted into sin by the devilish serpent, the Aztecs considered snakes powerful creatures symbolic of fertility and abundance. She of the Serpent Hills is the fertile earth from which we all come. Refer to the PDF chapter of the book for an extended explanation of Coatlicue's importance as an icon/myth in the Aztec culture. Like their descendants today, the ancient Aztecs spoke Nahuatl, which is an agglutinative language. Sorry, guys, for the pronunciation errors. And sorry about my cat in the background. That's Imogen. That means that several concepts can be joined into one word. The name Coatlicue is usually translated to mean she of the serpent skirts. If you look at the sculpture closely, you can see her head is formed by two profile serpent heads coming together to form a single frontal face. She has a fairly naturalistic collarbone, and below that, pendulous breasts covered by a necklace of human hearts and human hands with a pendant skull. A serpent belt is tied at her waist. Her skirt is comprised of interwoven serpents. Alternating snake heads and rattle tails are visible at the hem. Her legs, like her upraised arms, are represented by monstrous, alligator-like appendages. When the Aztecs were conquered by an army led by the Spaniard Hernan Cortes in 1521. Coatlicue was made sometime before that date, probably close to the time Columbus began his fateful first trip. Where? Coatlicue was a major monument of the Aztec imperial capital, the city they called Mexico Tenochtitlan, and we today call Mexico City. The Spaniards arrived in the Aztec capital city at the height of Aztec Empire. The city had been founded in circa 1350 BCE on a cluster of swampy islands in the middle of an immense lake that covered the floor of the Valley of Mexico. They were awed by the beauty and magnificence of the architecture, likening the Aztec capital to mythic cities described in medieval romances. After the conquest, the Spaniards tore down the Aztec buildings, using the stones to erect their own houses and churches. They built the main cathedral of Mexico right on top of what had been the ceremonial center of the Aztec capital. In their attempt to erase all remnants of the native religion and thereby facilitate the forced conversion to Christianity, the Spaniards broke up much of the Aztec sculpture. They rolled some of the particularly large pieces into ditches and buried them under dirt and rubble. Coatlicue was not rediscovered until the late 18th century when construction workers uncovered her near the Aztec calendar stone. How? A monumental 102 inches tall, Coatlicue is, like Michelangelo's David, an example of subtractive sculpture. The Aztec artists started with a boulder of basalt stone and carved away whatever they did not want to remain. The figure was then covered with stucco and brightly painted. Although the earth in which she was buried destroyed most of the original pigment, there are remnants still left in some of the deep crevices, enough to indicate strong contrasts that would allow the complex feature to be read from far distances. Why? Coatlicue was originally located in the Aztec ceremonial center, very near the immense double pyramid on top of which stood the temples dedicated to the two main Aztec gods. Anyone who entered the Aztec capital for commercial or political purposes would see her. They would be reminded of the Aztec rulers' claim to descent from Coatlicue's son, the war god, and of their justification of imperial extension based on their unique relationship with the goddess. Compare David and Coatlicue. In your textbook on pages 33 to 36, read an extended comparison of David and Coatlicue. Modern art and mass media, new ways of perceiving the art object. Roy Lichtenstein's lithograph, Cathedral Number 3, suggests the pervasive way the mass media influence our perception of fine art. Cathedral Number 3 refers to a famous series of paintings of Rouen Cathedral done in the 1890s by the great French Impressionist artist Claude Monet. The dots in Lichtenstein's work are meant to resemble the tiny dots formerly used to print photographs in books, magazines, and newspapers. And these are called halftone dots. If you do screen printing today, you still use that same technology. Modern art and mass media, new ways of perceiving the art object. Lichtenstein's painting illustrates what he calls the industrialization of art. The original art object, once it is pumped into the mass media, becomes yet another stereotype or cliche among all others. If the viewer ever does see the original art object, it is seen through the masks and labels already provided by the media. Art reproductions in books and magazines make us all like tourists visiting famous places. If we eventually have the opportunity, we cannot help comparing the original to the photograph. The impact of Lichtenstein's art is verified by anyone who has approached a famous painting like Leonardo's Mona Lisa in the Louvre. One is forced to elbow through a bustling crowd armed with headsets and cameras, only to find the art object cloistered in a vault protected by thick glass. What the viewer really sees is not so much an art object as yet another celebrity. Artists like Lichtenstein begin to ask how the individual art object, which traditionally represented the individuality of the artist, could have any real meaning when multiplied indefinitely in the mass media. The dots in Cathedral Number 3 suggest that Monet's painting will be easily recognized, not because so many people have seen Monet's original paintings, but so many people have seen printed photographs of them. For instance, a poster. Lichtenstein's work acknowledges that this kind of contact with images instead of real objects is a vital part of our way of seeing art today. It is as true for artists as it is for the public. In today's art world, even most professional painters, architects, sculptors, and others look at mass media images of art more than at unique art objects. For the public, illustrated exhibition catalogs printed by galleries and museums extend the artist's work in time and space far beyond the scope of the actual event. Vogue, Time, and other mass circulation magazines carry feature articles on modern art to the public at large on a regular basis. The mass media have made art icons both familiar and popular. What happens to the unique art object? The presence of fine art in the mass media has had its cost, however. The unique art object made by a unique individual drifts into an environment of swarming images spewing out from society's innumerable image-making and image-multiplying machines. This presented an inevitable conflict for fine art. The modern tradition of fine art stressed three inherent values. First, the value of the unique art object. Second, the value of the artist's individual personality. And third, the value of innovative artistic form. Unlike modern fine art, popular art for the mass media has always been intended to make as much money as possible. It is usually planned from the beginning as a commodity, the visual goal of which is to anticipate and meet the expectations of a large audience rather than to challenge that audience by either personal expression or artistic innovation. Western icons for the global gallery. The icon effect of our fine art and popular art images is particularly clear in their impact abroad. Abstract paintings and other forms of contemporary art have been especially associated with the United States since the late 1940s and early 1950s. this kind of painting and the styles of art that have succeeded it in America, are seen abroad not only as art, but, like our technology, as symbols of American progress and leadership. American programming makes up for as much as 40% of television time shown in countries ranging from Europe to the Near East to Asia. American popular culture heroes, from Mickey Mouse to the Marlboro Man to Rocky, consistently combine a sense of innocence, power, and individualism that has a seemingly universal appeal. The face of Mickey Mouse towers over Tokyo's favorite amusement park, Disneyland. Movie makers in India have made at least 3 different versions of Rocky. The Marlboro Man is not just a cowboy who sells cigarettes. He is an icon of American independence and self-reliance, recognized around the world. Our mass-mediated culture. The range of connections between fine art and mass media popular art reveal that our society itself is, in Michael Reel's phrase, an increasingly mass-mediated culture. It is a culture in which the average American watches over 4 hours of television each day. It is a culture in which presidential campaigns spend tens of millions of dollars on commercials using the same packaging and marketing techniques as those used to sell cars. In our mass-mediated culture, advertising and other popular culture images have strong connections with fine art. Advertising images are made by artists who are trained at the same art schools as aspiring painters. Courses in advertising teach that a good ad follows the same principles of line, color, and shape as a good painting. Advertising artists study and apply the entire fine art tradition of painting, photography, and film to create images calculated to transform the viewer into a consumer. Personal reflection. The mass media have made art icons both familiar and popular. Are there art icons that you regard as familiar and or popular? Why do you like these art pieces? Have you seen these art pieces in person? How have you seen these art pieces? In a museum, on the internet, in printed form, a magazine or book? How do you prefer to view art today? Would you rather go to a gallery or museum, or surf the web to find virtual art exhibitions to view? Do you feel you lose anything by viewing art virtually? Do you agree or disagree with Douglas Crimp? And finally, back to visual literacy. A sense of visual literacy today requires a knowledge not only of fine art, but also of how our fine art tradition has influenced and helped to produce our entire mass media environment, including advertising. As art critic Douglas Crimp writes, to an even greater extent, our experience is governed by pictures in newspapers and magazines, on television, and in the cinema. And today we would add on the internet. Next to these pictures, first-hand experience begins to retreat, to seem more and more trivial. While it once seemed that pictures had the function of interpreting reality, it now seems that they have usurped it. It therefore becomes imperative to understand the picture itself, not in order to recover a lost reality, but to determine how a picture becomes a signifying structure of its own accord.